In the heart of Nashville, Tennessee, a city buzzing with the rhythm of ambition and dreams, a brutal murder shattered the facade of normalcy. Ethan Harrison, a 27-year-old rising star in the medical field, was found lifeless in his upscale home on the evening of March 6, 2012. Blood pooled beneath his motionless body, the grim evidence of a struggle painting a chilling picture. The murder weapon, a sleek kitchen knife, lay discarded nearby, its surface smeared with the violent truth. The news sent shockwaves through Nashville. Ethan wasn't just another name, he was a prodigy. Known for his sharp intellect, unyielding work ethic, and charm that left both patients and colleagues in awe, Ethan represented the ideal of success. But as police dug deeper, they unearthed a tangled web of relationships, betrayals, and obsessions, dark corners that Ethan had kept hidden from the public eye. This was no random crime. The brutality of the act pointed to something personal, something rooted in emotion rather than mere opportunism. Ethan's once perfect world of achievement and admiration began to crumble, exposing fractures that no one had seen before. Ethan's journey to prominence had not been without sacrifice. Growing up in a modest town outside Nashville, he had witnessed his parents' strained marriage, their heated arguments often revolving around finances and unmet expectations. His father, a truck driver, spent weeks on the road, while his mother juggled 2 part-time jobs, leaving little room for affection or understanding. Ethan, the youngest of 3 siblings, became the family's beacon of hope, a role he shouldered with quiet determination. From a young age, he dreamed of escaping the suffocating weight of his parents' fractured relationship. He excelled in school, winning scholarships that paved the way for his medical career. By 27, Ethan was the youngest physician at a prestigious Nashville hospital. Patients adored his compassionate bedside manner, and his peers respected his razor-sharp clinical instincts. On paper, Ethan's life seemed like a perfect success story. But the image of perfection masked deep scars. Ethan's pursuit of excellence came at a cost. His personal life was a fractured mirror of fleeting relationships and unresolved emotions. A year before his death, Ethan had ended a toxic, emotionally draining relationship that left him disillusioned about love. He buried himself in work, convincing himself that his career would fill the void left by intimacy. Yet, Ethan wasn't immune to temptation. He relished the fleeting thrill of new connections, a distraction from the loneliness that lingered behind his professional accomplishments. When he smiled, his charm could disarm even the most guarded individuals. That smile, warm, confident, inviting, had drawn more than admiration, it had drawn danger. As Ethan's life unraveled posthumously, whispers began to circulate, whispers of young women captivated by his charisma, of secret rendezvous cloaked in shadows, and of promises he could never keep. Nashville's once bright hero became the center of a scandal steeped in envy and heartbreak. The night of March 6, 2012, marked the end of Ethan's ascension and the beginning of a sinister unraveling. What had started as harmless flirtations and casual connections spiraled into a deadly entanglement. Behind closed doors, jealousy brewed, resentment festered, and love curdled into something far more sinister. Little did Ethan know, the women he had charmed were no longer content to be mere chapters in his story. And as police stood over his lifeless body, one question loomed: who had been pushed too far? Long before his name became synonymous with scandal and tragedy, Ethan Harrison was the golden child of ambition, a shining example of resilience and determination. His story began in a small, unremarkable town just outside Nashville, where life was simple but far from idyllic. The youngest of 3 siblings, Ethan grew up in a household where love was often overshadowed by tension. His parents, hardworking but perpetually stressed, struggled to make ends meet. Arguments over bills, late nights filled with silence, and the weight of unrealized dreams left an indelible mark on the boy who watched it all from the sidelines. Ethan's father, Robert Harrison, was a truck driver who spent weeks on the road, returning home only to collapse into bed, exhausted and distant. His mother, Linda, juggled 2 part-time jobs, tirelessly trying to keep the family afloat while harboring her own resentment toward a life that hadn't turned out as she had envisioned. To young Ethan, their home was less a sanctuary and more a battleground, a place where warmth and connection were always just out of reach. Yet, even in the chaos, Ethan's brilliance shone through. From an early age, he displayed a natural aptitude for science and an insatiable curiosity about the human body. While his peers played in the streets, Ethan could often be found poring over borrowed biology textbooks or sketching anatomical diagrams in the margins of his notebooks. His teachers recognized his potential and nurtured it, often remarking that he was destined for something far greater than the confines of his small town. By the time Ethan was 18, he had secured a full scholarship to Vanderbilt University, marking the first step in his escape from the life he so desperately wanted to leave behind. His acceptance was celebrated by his family, but beneath the pride, there was a lingering bitterness. His siblings, neither as ambitious nor as academically inclined, struggled to find their footing in the world, and their jealousy toward Ethan's accomplishments grew as his star continued to rise. At Vanderbilt, Ethan thrived. He poured himself into his studies, spending countless nights in the library and rarely allowing himself the luxury of distraction. He knew the stakes. He wasn't just working for himself, but also for the version of his family he had always hoped to build, stable, secure, and free from the dysfunction of his upbringing. His drive was unparalleled, and by the time he graduated at the top of his class, he had already secured a coveted spot at one of Nashville's most prestigious medical programs. But success came at a price. The pressures of medical school, coupled with Ethan's relentless pursuit of perfection, left little room for personal connections. While his peers formed study groups and fostered lifelong friendships, Ethan remained aloof, preferring the solitude of his late-night study sessions to the camaraderie of shared meals or celebrations. He wore his loneliness like armor, convinced that attachments would only slow him down. By the time he completed his residency, Ethan had become the youngest attending physician at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Patients adored him for his calm demeanor and reassuring smile, while colleagues respected his clinical acumen and decisiveness. On the surface, he was everything the medical field could hope for: intelligent, compassionate, and dedicated. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, Ethan was a man deeply haunted by his past. The cracks in his perfect image began to show when he entered his first serious relationship, a whirlwind romance with a fellow resident named Abigail. What started as mutual admiration quickly devolved into a toxic cycle of arguments and emotional manipulation. Abigail, who was as ambitious as Ethan, resented his tendency to put his career above their relationship, while Ethan, scarred by his parents' volatile marriage, withdrew at the first sign of conflict. The relationship ended after a year, leaving Ethan emotionally drained and more determined than ever to avoid such entanglements in the future. He threw himself into his work, convinced that his career was the only thing he could truly control. But work couldn't fill the void forever. As Ethan's reputation grew, so did the attention he received from others, patients, colleagues, even strangers. At first, he dismissed it as harmless admiration, but over time, he began to relish the validation it brought. Relationships became a way for Ethan to distract himself from the loneliness that gnawed at him in quiet moments. He told himself it was harmless, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, Ethan knew he was playing a dangerous game. The very thing he sought to escape, emotional entanglements, conflict, and chaos, was slowly creeping back into his life. He just hadn't realized yet how high the stakes had become. Ethan's brilliance had carried him far, but his past, his choices, and his inability to confront his own emotional wounds were waiting in the shadows. And soon, they would consume him entirely. Emma Collins was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. At 20 years old, she exuded an effortless charm that came from a life of being the youngest in her family, always indulged and never overlooked. With her auburn curls bouncing as she walked and her easy laugh that seemed to echo long after she left, Emma was magnetic in a way few could resist. Yet beneath her vibrant exterior lay a restless heart, forever seeking the thrill of something, or someone, new. A literature major at Belmont University in Nashville, Emma had big dreams of writing the next great American novel. Her professors praised her creativity, but her friends teased her about her tendency to drift through life, taking everything a little too lightly. For Emma, though, life was about experiences, not obligations. She believed in living for the moment, not planning for the future. This philosophy extended to her relationships, which were often as fleeting as the seasons. It was in May 2011, on a crisp spring afternoon, that Emma's life took a turn. During a weekend hiking trip in Percy Warner Park, she twisted her ankle on a rocky trail. The pain was sharp but manageable, and her friends insisted she see a doctor. 2 days later, Emma found herself in the pristine waiting room of Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where she first met Dr. Ethan Harrison. Ethan entered the exam room with his usual calm professionalism, clipboard in hand and a reassuring smile on his face. To Emma, he looked like he had just stepped out of a magazine, tall, poised, with an air of quiet confidence that made her feel immediately at ease. As he examined her ankle, asking questions in a low, measured voice, Emma found herself unusually attentive. She wasn't used to feeling nervous around anyone, yet Ethan had a way of commanding her focus without trying. "You'll be fine," Ethan said, straightening up after finishing his examination. "Just a mild sprain. Rest it, ice it, and you'll be back on the trails in no time." Emma smiled, but her mind raced for a reason to linger. "Thanks, Dr. Harrison, is it? You're not like most doctors, too serious, you know?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Seriousness comes with the territory, but I try to keep it balanced." His response, so measured yet charming, struck Emma as intriguing. As she left the office, she couldn't help glancing back, catching Ethan scribbling something on her chart. That glance lingered in her thoughts long after she returned home. Emma began finding excuses to return to the hospital. She called with questions about her recovery, scheduled follow-ups that weren't strictly necessary, and even asked about hypothetical injuries. It wasn't long before these interactions turned into casual conversations. Ethan, ever professional but subtly flattered by her attention, allowed himself to engage. What began as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into something more. By mid-June, Ethan and Emma were meeting outside the hospital. Their first outing, a coffee shop tucked away in a quiet Nashville neighborhood, felt thrilling to Emma, like a stolen moment out of one of her favorite novels. Ethan's mature demeanor and ability to listen captivated her, a stark contrast to the carefree boys she typically dated. For Ethan, Emma was a breath of fresh air. Her energy, her ability to find joy in the mundane, and her unwavering attention offered a reprieve from the emotional weight of his work and personal struggles. She didn't expect anything from him beyond the present moment, and for a man like Ethan, who shied away from commitments, that was exactly what he needed. But as the summer wore on, cracks began to form in their seemingly perfect arrangement. Emma, despite her initial declarations of wanting nothing serious, began to feel something deeper. She told herself it was just the excitement of being with someone older and wiser, someone who seemed to see the world in a way she didn't yet understand. But her growing attachment was undeniable. Ethan, however, remained detached. He appreciated Emma's company but saw their relationship as a distraction, a way to escape his own loneliness without confronting it. He kept her at arm's length, never letting her too far into his world. When Emma gently probed for details about his personal life, Ethan would deflect, turning the conversation back to her. The imbalance between them grew more evident with time. While Emma began to envision a narrative where Ethan played a central role, Ethan viewed their time together as chapters that would eventually come to an end. By late July, Emma started noticing subtle signs that Ethan's attention wasn't exclusively hers. A missed call here, a vague excuse there, it all began to add up. One day, while waiting for Ethan outside his office, Emma overheard a conversation between him and another woman, the tone unmistakably familiar. Though she didn't confront him directly, Emma couldn't shake the creeping doubt. The realization that Ethan might not be the person she thought he was, the person she wanted him to be, stung more than she was willing to admit. For the first time, Emma felt a pang of insecurity, a sensation foreign to someone so accustomed to being the center of attention. Emma's world, once so carefree and buoyant, began to tilt. She wasn't ready to let go, not yet. But deep down, she knew their story was headed for a storm, and she was powerless to stop it. Claire Morgan sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee as the morning sun filtered through the blinds. It was another long day ahead, work, errands, and caring for her 8-year-old son, Ben. Claire's life had become a balancing act since her divorce, one that left little room for anything beyond survival. But she carried on, determined to create a stable life for Ben, even if it meant ignoring the gnawing emptiness inside her. At 30, Claire was no stranger to disappointment. She had married young, convinced that her high school sweetheart was the answer to her dreams of love and stability. But over time, her husband became distant, consumed by his career while Claire shouldered the weight of parenting and managing their household. By the time Ben was 5, the cracks in their marriage had become insurmountable. The divorce was messy, leaving Claire to start over from scratch. Her job as a real estate agent provided just enough income to keep them afloat, but the long hours and high demands left her drained. While she had a few friends, none truly understood the depth of her struggles. Every decision she made revolved around Ben, ensuring he had a good school, a safe home, and the kind of upbringing she never wanted him to look back on with resentment. But there were nights when the loneliness crept in, and Claire found herself longing for something more, a partner, a confidant, someone who could make her feel seen again. It was during one of Ben's routine checkups at Vanderbilt University Medical Center that Claire met Ethan Harrison. The moment he walked into the exam room, Claire noticed how he immediately engaged with Ben, asking him about his favorite sports and making him laugh as he checked his vitals. Ethan's ease with children was striking, and his attentiveness wasn't just professional, it felt genuine. "Mom," Ben said after they left the appointment, "Dr. Harrison's cool. Way cooler than Mr. Johnson," referring to his former pediatrician. Claire smiled at her son's innocence, but her thoughts lingered on Ethan. It had been years since she'd felt drawn to someone, and she chastised herself for even entertaining the idea. He was likely too young, too busy, and far beyond her world. Yet, she couldn't ignore the warmth he exuded, a warmth she had been craving for so long. Over the next few months, Claire found reasons to visit the hospital more often. Minor concerns about Ben's health turned into opportunities to see Ethan again, each encounter leaving her a little more hopeful. To her surprise, Ethan seemed to welcome her presence. Their conversations grew longer, moving beyond medical topics to casual chats about life, books, and even favorite coffee shops in Nashville. For Claire, it felt like a door opening to something she had long thought was out of reach. Ethan's intelligence, kindness, and maturity made her believe he could be the man to bring stability and companionship back into her life. She began to imagine a future where Ben had a strong male figure to look up to, a future where she wasn't navigating life alone. But as their interactions deepened, cracks began to form in Claire's hopeful narrative. Ethan was polite, even charming, but there was a distance to him she couldn't quite bridge. He avoided sharing personal details, deflecting questions about his life outside the hospital. At first, Claire attributed it to his busy schedule, but a lingering doubt began to take root. One evening, as Claire prepared dinner, she scrolled through social media and stumbled upon a photo. It was a mutual acquaintance from the hospital, a casual group picture, but what caught her attention was Ethan standing beside a young woman, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The caption mentioned a local cafe, and Claire's heart sank. She recognized the cafe, Ethan had mentioned it to her during one of their chats. For the next few days, Claire tried to push the image out of her mind, but it gnawed at her. When she finally mustered the courage to ask Ethan about it during a chance encounter at the hospital, his response was nonchalant. "Oh, that's Emma. Just a friend," he said with a faint smile, offering no further explanation. Claire didn't press him, but the seed of doubt had already bloomed. She began noticing subtle patterns, missed calls, vague excuses, and a growing sense that Ethan's world was far more complicated than he let on. By late summer, Claire's optimism had turned into quiet frustration. She couldn't deny her feelings for Ethan, but the realization that he might never reciprocate them fully was a bitter pill to swallow. Her hope, once so vivid, began to dim under the weight of reality. Yet, Claire wasn't ready to give up. She told herself that Ethan was guarded because of his past, that if she gave him time, he would see what she saw, a chance for something real, something lasting. What she didn't realize was that her persistence, born from love and longing, would set off a chain of events she could never take back. Hope had carried Claire this far, but the path ahead was paved with heartbreak, and she was walking it blindfolded. Sophia Bennett was a woman accustomed to living behind a polished mask. At 25 years old, she epitomized grace and poise, with her flawless appearance and composed demeanor earning her admiration wherever she went. She was the picture-perfect wife of Daniel Bennett, a successful businessman whose name carried weight in Nashville's elite circles. But beneath the surface, Sophia's life was far from perfect. Her marriage, though enviable on paper, was a suffocating performance, held together by social obligations and appearances rather than love or understanding. From the outside, Sophia and Daniel seemed untouchable. They attended charity galas hand in hand, posed for glossy magazine features, and hosted lavish dinner parties that showcased their sprawling estate. But behind closed doors, their interactions were cold, calculated, and devoid of any genuine connection. Daniel's focus was perpetually fixed on his work, leaving Sophia to navigate their hollow marriage alone. She was a trophy wife, a role she had grown to resent but felt powerless to escape. It was in this state of emotional isolation that Sophia met Ethan Harrison. It was a routine visit to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, one of those perfunctory checkups that Daniel insisted on for the sake of maintaining appearances. Sophia had expected nothing more than a sterile appointment, but Ethan's presence caught her off guard. Ethan was unlike anyone she had encountered in her carefully curated world. His confidence was effortless, his demeanor warm yet professional. When he spoke to her, his attention was undivided, a stark contrast to Daniel, who rarely acknowledged her unless it involved a public setting. As Ethan explained the results of her tests, Sophia found herself captivated, her pulse quickening in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their connection deepened over subsequent visits. Sophia, initially hesitant, began finding reasons to return to the hospital, minor concerns about her health, follow-ups that could have been handled over the phone. Ethan, while maintaining his professionalism, couldn't deny the pull between them. There was a subtle chemistry, a shared understanding that neither dared to voice aloud at first. By April 2011, their meetings had moved beyond the hospital walls. A chance encounter at a downtown cafe turned into an impromptu conversation that stretched into hours. Sophia confided in Ethan about the loneliness of her marriage, her struggles to meet the expectations placed upon her, and the suffocating weight of living for someone else's image. Ethan listened, offering empathy without judgment, a rarity in Sophia's world. For Sophia, Ethan represented freedom. He was everything Daniel wasn't: attentive, approachable, and unburdened by the rigid constructs of her social circle. Being with him felt like stepping into a life she had always dreamed of but never thought she could have. She began to see Ethan not just as an escape but as a lifeline, a possibility for a future unshackled from her current reality. But Sophia's growing attachment to Ethan wasn't without complications. She wasn't naive, she knew her actions were risky. Nashville was a small city when it came to high society, and whispers had a way of spreading like wildfire. Yet, the thrill of secrecy only added to the allure. What Sophia didn't anticipate was how deeply she would fall. By the summer of 2011, she was consumed by thoughts of Ethan. Every glance, every stolen moment replayed in her mind long after they had parted. She began neglecting her social obligations, finding herself increasingly distracted during events with Daniel. Her double life was exhilarating but also exhausting, and the cracks in her carefully maintained facade were beginning to show. Then came the turning point. Sophia had started to notice subtle changes in Ethan's behavior, missed messages, distracted responses, and a hesitation she hadn't sensed before. At first, she dismissed it as stress from his demanding job, but an unexpected encounter at the hospital brought her fears to life. She saw Ethan in the hallway, speaking to a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was young, vibrant, and animated in her conversation with Ethan. There was a familiarity between them that made Sophia's chest tighten. When Sophia confronted Ethan later, he brushed off her concerns with a practiced ease. "That's just Emma, a patient," he explained, his tone casual. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Sophia found herself spiraling. She began obsessively replaying their interactions, searching for signs she might have missed. Her jealousy, once a quiet hum, grew into a deafening roar. She started showing up unannounced at places Ethan frequented, her once graceful demeanor giving way to desperation. Sophia's obsession with Ethan wasn't just about him, it was about the freedom and validation he represented. Losing him would mean returning to the life she so desperately wanted to escape, a prospect she couldn't bear to face. But her actions, driven by fear and longing, were pushing Ethan further away. The tension between them came to a head one evening in late August 2011. Sophia, unable to contain her emotions, accused Ethan of keeping secrets, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and vulnerability. Ethan, visibly uncomfortable, tried to reassure her, but his words felt hollow. The distance between them was growing, and for the first time, Sophia saw the limits of their relationship. By the end of the summer, Sophia's perfect world was unraveling. Her obsession with Ethan had taken on a life of its own, consuming her thoughts and dictating her actions. She was no longer the composed, poised woman Daniel married, she had become someone driven by desperation, clinging to a connection that was slipping through her fingers. Sophia didn't know it yet, but her growing instability would set off a chain of events that would change everything. What had started as a quiet yearning for freedom was about to escalate into chaos, and the fallout would be devastating. Claire Morgan sat in her car outside Vanderbilt University Medical Center, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared through the windshield, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of everything she had seen and heard in the past few weeks. Ethan's excuses, his fleeting smiles, his growing distance, all of it pointed to a truth she couldn't ignore. He wasn't hers. Maybe he never had been. The photo she'd seen online of Ethan with another woman had been the first crack in the foundation of her hope. But it was the whispers she overheard in the hospital, a nurse mentioning Ethan's name alongside Sophia Bennett's, that shattered her fragile dream. Sophia wasn't just another fling. She was married, wealthy, and lived in a world Claire could never hope to be part of. For days, Claire wrestled with her emotions, jealousy, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. She had spent months building a fantasy around Ethan, imagining a life where he would see her worth, embrace her son, and create the family she had always longed for. Now, that dream was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know how to stop it. One evening, as Claire sat alone in her modest apartment, an idea began to take shape. If she couldn't confront Ethan directly, perhaps she could find another way to disrupt the growing connection between him and Sophia. Her mind lingered on Sophia's husband, Daniel Bennett, a man whose name carried weight in Nashville's social circles. If Daniel knew what his wife was doing, wouldn't he act? Wouldn't he confront Ethan and tear apart the affair that threatened Claire's own tenuous bond with him? Fueled by a mix of desperation and anger, Claire began researching Daniel Bennett. She combed through social media, business articles, and local gossip blogs, piecing together a picture of the man. He was powerful, influential, and by all accounts, deeply possessive of Sophia. If anyone could put a stop to what was happening between Sophia and Ethan, it was Daniel. Late one night, Claire crafted an email. Using an anonymous account, she typed out a message that was short and to the point. Mr. Bennett. I thought you should know that your wife, Sophia, has been spending time with Dr. Ethan Harrison. I've seen them together at the hospital and around town. You deserve to know the truth. Claire stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the send button. A small voice in her mind urged her to stop, to think about the consequences. But another voice, the one fueled by hurt and rage, drowned it out. With a sharp inhale, she pressed send. For days, there was no response. Claire tried to go about her life, but the guilt of what she'd done lingered. Had Daniel received the email? Was he investigating? Or worse, had she just made things worse for herself by involving him? She didn't have to wonder for long. A week later, while picking Ben up from school, Claire noticed a sleek black car idling across the street. Its driver, a man in a tailored suit with piercing eyes, seemed to be watching her. Claire's pulse quickened. She recognized him from her online research. It was Daniel Bennett. That evening, Claire received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, Daniel's voice was calm but cold. Miss Morgan, he began, his tone laced with authority. I received your email. I trust you have evidence to back up your claims? Claire hesitated, her mind scrambling for an answer. I've seen them together, she said finally, her voice trembling. At the hospital. They're not just colleagues. Daniel was silent for a moment, and Claire could hear the faint sound of his breathing. Then he spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, he said. I'll handle it from here. Claire didn't know what to expect next, but she had hoped her actions would endear her to Ethan in some twisted way, that by exposing Sophia's affair, she would eliminate her competition. Instead, things only grew more complicated. In the days that followed, Ethan seemed distant, even more than before. He avoided Claire's calls and brushed off her attempts to meet. Meanwhile, rumors began swirling within the hospital, whispers of tension between Ethan and Sophia that were impossible to ignore. Claire's plan had worked in part, but the results were far from what she had hoped for. Unbeknownst to Claire, Daniel had taken her email as a declaration of war. He began tailing Sophia, tracking her movements and collecting evidence of her infidelity. His obsession with uncovering the truth grew darker with each passing day. What Claire had intended as a way to protect her fragile dream had instead unleashed a force far beyond her control. By the time Claire realized the extent of the chaos she had set in motion, it was too late. The storm she had stirred was already raging, and the consequences were inevitable. Her desperation, born from love and longing, had become the catalyst for a chain of events that would lead to destruction. Claire had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. What she thought was a simple act of self-preservation had instead become a dangerous game, and everyone involved was about to lose. The night of March 6, 2012, was quiet in Ethan Harrison's upscale Nashville neighborhood. Streetlights cast a faint glow over the empty sidewalks, and the hum of distant traffic was the only sound breaking the stillness. Inside Ethan's home, however, tension simmered beneath the surface. Ethan sat in his living room, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at his phone. Messages from Claire, Emma, and Sophia blinked on the screen, unanswered. His chest tightened as he scrolled through them. He had spent the past year juggling relationships, seeking solace in the fleeting attention they offered. But now, everything was unraveling. Sophia had grown increasingly demanding, her texts laced with accusations and desperation. Emma, once carefree, was now asking questions about their future. And Claire, whose quiet affection had once seemed harmless, had become a looming presence he couldn't escape. Each of these women represented a part of his life he had tried to compartmentalize, but now those parts were colliding in ways he hadn't anticipated. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. He needed to clear his head, to figure out how to untangle himself from the mess he had created. But he would never get the chance. At 9:47 p.m., the doorbell rang. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the clock. He wasn't expecting anyone. Placing his glass on the table, he moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. Daniel Bennett stood on the other side, his expression calm but unreadable. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He had met Daniel briefly at a hospital gala, introduced as Sophia's husband. At the time, Daniel had been cordial, even distant, giving no indication of suspicion. But tonight, his presence felt ominous. Ethan opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "What brings you here?" Daniel stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room. He moved with a quiet intensity, the kind of presence that commanded attention without words. "I think you know why I'm here," Daniel said finally, his tone even but cold. Ethan's pulse quickened. He closed the door behind them, trying to maintain his composure. "Look, I don't know what Sophia told you, but—" Daniel cut him off with a raised hand. "This isn't about what Sophia said. This is about what I know. And what I know," he continued, stepping closer, "is that you've been seeing my wife." Ethan's mind raced. He considered denying it, deflecting, but Daniel's piercing gaze told him it would be futile. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice softer now. "It was a mistake. It's over." Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. "A mistake," he repeated. "You think you can just walk away from this? Walk away from the damage you've done?" Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." But the words hung hollow in the air, and Ethan could see the storm brewing behind Daniel's calm facade. The confrontation escalated quickly. Daniel's voice, once measured, grew louder, more volatile. Accusations flew, each one sharper than the last, cutting into Ethan's defenses. He tried to reason with Daniel, to calm him down, but his words fell on deaf ears. When Daniel reached into his coat, Ethan's instincts screamed at him to act. But it wasn't a gun that Daniel pulled out, it was a sleek kitchen knife, the blade gleaming under the dim light. Ethan's breath hitched. "Daniel, put that down," he said, his voice trembling now. "You don't want to do this." But Daniel had already crossed the point of no return. The pain, the humiliation, the betrayal, it all boiled over in a single, uncontrollable moment. He lunged. The struggle that followed was brutal. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and desperate shouts echoed through the house. Ethan fought back with everything he had, but Daniel's rage gave him an almost inhuman strength. The blade found its mark again and again, each thrust driving deeper until Ethan's resistance faltered. By the time the room fell silent, Daniel stood over Ethan's lifeless body, his chest heaving. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. Blood pooled around Ethan, staining the once pristine living room carpet. Daniel stumbled back, his mind reeling. For a brief moment, he stood frozen, staring at the scene before him. Then, as the gravity of what he had done began to sink in, he turned and fled into the night, leaving chaos in his wake. When the police arrived hours later, summoned by a neighbor who had heard the commotion, they found a crime scene that spoke volumes. Ethan's body bore the evidence of a violent struggle, his hands still bloodied from his attempts to fend off the attack. The living room was in disarray, the shattered remnants of his life scattered across the floor. News of Ethan's murder spread quickly, shaking Nashville's tight-knit community to its core. To those who knew him, the tragedy was unthinkable. But as investigators delved into his life, the secrets he had kept carefully hidden began to surface. Ethan Harrison, the brilliant young doctor with a promising future, was now the center of a dark tale of jealousy, betrayal, and obsession. And as the threads of his relationships unraveled, it became clear that his death was not just the result of one man's rage, but the culmination of a web of choices, mistakes, and desires that had spiraled out of control. The tragedy of Ethan Harrison was more than just a loss. It was a reckoning. The investigation into Ethan Harrison's murder began before the blood on his living room carpet had even dried. The brutality of the crime shocked Nashville's law enforcement, but it was the personal nature of the attack that left detectives convinced the killer had known their victim. Ethan hadn't been a random target, his death was calculated, fueled by emotion, and carried out with deliberate intensity. Lead Detective Sarah Whitman, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for unraveling the most complex cases, stood at the scene, her sharp eyes scanning the chaos. The overturned furniture, the shattered glass, and the bloody knife left at the scene all painted a grim picture. Ethan had fought for his life, but whoever had done this had been relentless. Start with his personal life, Whitman instructed her team. Someone had a reason to kill him, and I want to know what it was. The initial interviews revealed a man whose charm and ambition masked a tangled web of relationships. Colleagues described Ethan as brilliant but private, a man who rarely spoke about his personal life. Patients praised his kindness, but some hinted at rumors of flirtations with female clients. These rumors soon led detectives to dig deeper into Ethan's connections outside of work. It didn't take long for the name Sophia Bennett to surface. Witnesses had seen Ethan and Sophia together on multiple occasions, their interactions far too intimate to be dismissed as professional. When detectives contacted Sophia, she appeared distraught, her polished demeanor cracking under the weight of Ethan's death. Ethan was a friend, she stammered, her eyes darting to avoid their gaze. I don't understand why anyone would want to hurt him. But Whitman wasn't convinced. Sophia's reluctance to provide details and the obvious tension in her voice suggested she was hiding something. The revelation that she was married to Daniel Bennett, one of Nashville's most prominent businessmen, only deepened the intrigue. Daniel Bennett became the next focus of the investigation. His powerful reputation and tightly controlled public image clashed with the whispers detectives began to uncover, whispers of a man prone to jealousy and a need for control. When questioned, Daniel maintained a calm facade, offering an alibi that placed him at his office the night of the murder. I don't know what my wife does in her free time, he said coldly when asked about Sophia's relationship with Ethan. But I had no reason to hurt Dr. Harrison. Despite his composed exterior, investigators found inconsistencies in his story. Surveillance footage showed Daniel's car near Ethan's neighborhood the night of the murder, and a search of his phone revealed a series of calls to Sophia, each increasingly heated in tone, in the days leading up to Ethan's death. As the case progressed, another name surfaced, Claire Morgan. A single mother and one of Ethan's former patients, Claire had been seen frequently at the hospital in the months before his death. When questioned, she seemed nervous, her voice trembling as she denied any involvement in the crime. I cared about Ethan, she admitted, her eyes welling with tears. But I would never hurt him. He was important to me. Her phone records, however, told a different story. Investigators discovered an anonymous email sent from Claire's account to Daniel Bennett, detailing Ethan and Sophia's affair. The timing of the email, just a week before the murder, raised alarms. When confronted, Claire broke down, admitting to sending the message but insisting she never intended for anyone to get hurt. I wanted him to see what he was doing to me, she sobbed. I didn't think Daniel would. I didn't know he was capable of this. As Whitman pieced together the threads of the case, it became clear that Ethan's death was the result of more than just one man's rage. It was a culmination of jealousy, obsession, and betrayal, each player contributing to the tragedy in their own way. Sophia's affair with Ethan had ignited Daniel's fury, pushing him to act on the knowledge Claire had provided. Claire's desperate attempt to reclaim Ethan's attention had inadvertently set the wheels in motion, and Ethan himself had underestimated the consequences of his actions, failing to see how his choices had drawn these individuals into a dangerous orbit around him. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis revealed Daniel's fingerprints on the knife left at the scene. Combined with surveillance footage and the threatening messages he had sent to Ethan, the evidence was damning. On March 20, 2012, Daniel Bennett was arrested at his downtown office, his composed exterior finally cracking as officers led him away in handcuffs. But Daniel's arrest didn't bring closure. During questioning, he claimed he hadn't acted alone. "She wanted this as much as I did," he said, implicating Claire. "She pushed me to do it, made me see how he was ruining everything." Detectives were left with a tangled web of accusations and half-truths. While Daniel's role in the murder was undeniable, Claire's involvement remained a gray area. Had she merely sent the email out of spite, or had she intentionally fueled Daniel's rage, knowing what he might do? As the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, one truth became clear: Ethan Harrison's death was not just a crime of passion, but a tragic intersection of fractured lives. Each person's actions, born from longing, betrayal, or desperation, had contributed to the fateful night that ended his life. The secrets had been uncovered, but the wounds they left behind were far from healed. The tragedy of Ethan Harrison was more than just the loss of a promising young doctor, it was a chilling reminder of the destructive power of unchecked emotions. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Daniel Bennett began in July 2013. The case had captivated Nashville, with every detail of Dr. Ethan Harrison's tragic murder splashed across newspapers and dissected on local news. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, a mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and friends of the victim, all eager to witness the unraveling of a crime that had exposed the darker sides of jealousy, betrayal, and obsession. Inside, the atmosphere was somber. Ethan's parents sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief, while Claire Morgan and Sophia Bennett occupied separate seats, each struggling with their own emotions. The defendant, Daniel Bennett, sat rigid at the defense table, his expression unreadable as the proceedings began. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Margaret Lacey, wasted no time painting Daniel as a man consumed by rage. In her opening statement, she described him as a controlling husband who couldn't tolerate the thought of losing his wife to another man. Daniel Bennett did not act out of impulse, Lacey declared to the jury. He meticulously planned this crime, stalking Dr. Harrison and confronting him in his home, armed with a weapon and a singular intent, to eliminate the man he believed had taken what was his. Lacey presented the evidence methodically, each piece building on the last. Surveillance footage placed Daniel near Ethan's neighborhood the night of the murder. Forensic analysis confirmed his fingerprints on the knife, while messages on his phone revealed a series of increasingly aggressive texts to Sophia and anonymous threats sent to Ethan. But the most damning evidence came from Daniel himself, his confession. In recorded interviews, Daniel admitted to killing Ethan but claimed he hadn't acted alone. "I wasn't the only one who wanted him gone," he had said, pointing the finger at Claire Morgan. The defense, led by the formidable attorney Charles Grayson, argued that Daniel's actions, while regrettable, were not premeditated. Instead, they painted him as a man pushed to the brink by the betrayal of his wife and the manipulation of Claire Morgan. Daniel Bennett was a broken man, Grayson told the jury. His world crumbled when he discovered his wife's infidelity, and Claire Morgan only made it worse. She fed his insecurities, encouraged his anger, and pushed him toward a path he never intended to take. Grayson's strategy centered on shifting blame onto Claire. The anonymous email she sent to Daniel, detailing Ethan and Sophia's affair, became a key piece of evidence. The defense portrayed it as a calculated act designed to provoke Daniel into confronting Ethan, knowing full well it could escalate. Claire was called to testify, her appearance drawing audible gasps from the courtroom. Pale and visibly shaken, she recounted her relationship with Ethan, her feelings of betrayal, and the impulsive decision to send the email. "I didn't think he would. I didn't think this would happen," Claire said, her voice trembling. I just wanted him to know the truth. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." The prosecution defended Claire, emphasizing that while her actions may have been ill-advised, she had no direct involvement in Ethan's murder. However, the defense's relentless cross-examination painted a different picture. "Ms. Morgan," Grayson said, his tone sharp, "you knew Daniel Bennett was an influential, emotionally volatile man. Did you not consider how he might react to the information you provided?" Claire hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. Sophia's testimony added another layer of complexity. Tearful and contrite, she admitted to her affair with Ethan, describing it as a desperate attempt to escape her loveless marriage. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," she said, her voice breaking. But her answers were evasive when questioned about her knowledge of Daniel's growing anger. "Mrs. Bennett," Lacey pressed, "did you ever warn Dr. Harrison that your husband might retaliate?" Sophia looked down, unable to answer. Her silence left the jury to infer her complicity, intentional or not, in the events leading up to Ethan's death. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments brought the focus back to the central figure of the case, Daniel Bennett. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the evidence and convict him of first-degree murder, citing the premeditation involved in stalking Ethan, bringing a weapon, and carrying out the attack. The defense pleaded for leniency, asking the jury to recognize the emotional turmoil Daniel had endured and to consider reducing the charge to second-degree murder. They argued that Claire Morgan and Sophia Bennett had both played roles in driving Daniel to his breaking point. The jury deliberated for 3 days before delivering their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Daniel Bennett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the courtroom as the weight of the sentence sank in, but there was little relief for those involved. For Ethan's family, the verdict offered a measure of justice but no closure. "No sentence will bring our son back," his mother said outside the courthouse, clutching a photograph of Ethan. Claire Morgan left the courtroom under a cloud of scrutiny. Though not charged, her reputation was in tatters, and whispers of her role in the tragedy followed her wherever she went. Sophia Bennett filed for divorce from Daniel shortly after the trial, retreating from public life. But she too bore the scars of the events, her name forever tied to a story of betrayal and loss. The trial of Daniel Bennett became more than just a legal proceeding, it was a reflection of the destructive power of jealousy, obsession, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. Ethan Harrison's death was a tragedy that left no one untouched, a cautionary tale that lingered long after the gavel fell. In the end, justice had been served, but the wounds left behind would take far longer to heal. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of Ethan Harrison's life and death lingered in Nashville. The trial had come to an end, the verdict delivered, yet the wounds left by the events surrounding his murder remained raw and exposed. Justice, though served, had done little to soothe the anguish etched on the faces of those left behind. Daniel Bennett was transferred to a maximum security prison to begin his life sentence. Once a powerful figure in Nashville's elite circles, Daniel had become a cautionary tale, a man whose jealousy and rage destroyed not only his life but the lives of everyone connected to him. His days were now spent in isolation, haunted by the knowledge that his actions had stripped him of everything, his freedom, his marriage, and the respect he had once commanded. Sophia Bennett disappeared from public life. She divorced Daniel and moved to another state, seeking anonymity and a fresh start. But no distance could erase the guilt that weighed heavily on her. The choices she had made, the affair she had pursued with Ethan, and her silence in the face of Daniel's growing fury, all of it had contributed to the chain of events that ended in tragedy. For Sophia, the memories were an inescapable shadow, a constant reminder of the destruction her actions had sown. Claire Morgan returned to her modest life, but nothing was the same. The trial had left her reputation in ruins, her name whispered with disdain and judgment. Friends distanced themselves, and the small community she once called home now regarded her with suspicion. While she hadn't faced legal charges, the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. Claire struggled to rebuild her life for the sake of her son, Ben, who was too young to fully grasp the weight of what had happened. Behind closed doors, Claire wrestled with her guilt. She replayed her actions over and over, wondering if she could have stopped the tragedy before it began. The email she sent to Daniel, born of desperation and anger, had been the spark that ignited the fire. She never intended for Ethan to die, but intention meant little in the face of consequence. And then there was Ethan Harrison. His name became a tragic symbol of how unchecked emotions and fractured relationships could spiral out of control. To his patients, he remained the compassionate doctor who had made them feel seen and heard. To his family, he was the beloved son they had lost too soon. But to the public, Ethan's story was a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the human capacity for destruction when jealousy, obsession, and betrayal collided. Ethan's brilliance and promise were overshadowed by the complexity of his personal life, a life that had drawn others into its orbit with devastating consequences. The people who once admired him now debated his legacy. Was he a victim of circumstances beyond his control, or did his choices bear some responsibility for the tragedy that unfolded? The community, too, bore the scars of the tragedy. Conversations about love, trust, and the limits of forgiveness rippled through Nashville. How much could one person's actions influence the choices of others? Could any of this have been prevented if someone had stepped away instead of digging deeper into their emotions? Years later, the house where Ethan had lived remained unsold, a silent monument to the events that had unfolded within its walls. Passers-by often glanced at it, their minds racing with whispers of the story that had gripped the city. It stood as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most promising lives, shadows could linger, waiting to consume everything in their path. What do you think about Ethan Harrison's story? Was he simply a victim, or do his actions bear some responsibility for what happened? How much of the blame lies with Daniel, Sophia, or Claire? Could any of them have stopped the tragedy from unfolding? Have you ever witnessed how jealousy or obsession can spiral out of control in relationships? What lessons can be learned from this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime stories, and subscribe for more gripping tales that uncover the darker sides of human nature.